And now let's dive a little more into the conceptual framework and also into the practical implications of the global solutions idea and also of this year's motto, shedding light from 5 very distinct perspectives on how to best listen to the world. I'm very glad that for this I can hand over to my colleague Annette Weisbach, Frankfurt-based correspondent from the CNBC. I'm going to leave these now empty chairs and also the pleasure of introducing our participants of this panel to you. Please welcome Annette Weisbach.
I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for having me today and to moderate the opening panel session, which is listening to the world, promoting social well-being within planetary boundaries. As already pointed out, we would like to try at least define the current situation where we are in 2 years after the outbreak of Corona, in the middle of a war in Europe, but taking the opportunity to also sort of assess what that will mean for tackling global problems which are still here and perhaps even are aggravated by the current crisis. And to discuss that all, I'm now, of course, joined by an excellent panel, very diverse, to find different approaches to the issues. And I'm very honored to be joined by Dennis Noer, of course, the president of the Global Solutions Summit. Perhaps, Dennis, you come to the floor, and your seat will be right there. Then we have Colin Kelly, who is Global Leader Corporate Sustainability at PwC. I think you are sitting here. And Daniela Schwarzer, of course, Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia Open Society Foundations, and her place is in the middle. And then we're still waiting for Professor Bambang, who is getting mic'd up at the moment. But Gabriela Ramos, she's joining us online, is already here. She's Assistant Director General for Social and Human Science at UNESCO. Thank you very much for joining us. Hope you're hearing us very well as well. Great. So we're waiting a little moment, but we can also, I think, perhaps we start the discussion already while waiting, because we don't have that much time. We have 45 minutes or 43 minutes, and we have quite a long list of issues we want to talk about. And I would like to take the opportunity, perhaps, that everybody of you kind of says who they are, what they do, and what their current assessment is, shortly at least. Perhaps we start off with Daniela.
Thank you very much, Annette. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I lead the work of the Open Society Foundations in Europe and Eurasia. OSF is the largest foundation in the world that works for rule of law and democracy. And by definition, what keeps us busy most in our region at the moment is Russia's war in Ukraine. It is a war that goes well beyond the country, and I'm happy to discuss the dimensions of this war for Europe, but also globally on this panel, because it is a very serious threat to the order that we have lived in so happily for the past decades.
Yeah, indeed, that's very true. Professor Bambang, we were just saying that we are trying to shortly, just that you introduce yourself shortly, where you're from, what are your topics?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm Bambang Brojonegoro, currently Professor of Economics at University of Indonesia, and also co-chair of G20 Indonesia. And again, the topic will be in line with the Indonesian G20 presidency, which is recover stronger, recover together. And we focus on 3 areas: the digital, the pandemic issue, as well as the climate change.
Dennis, I think perhaps a couple of words from your side, what your main points would be.
I think very briefly, the world, as I've indicated in my opening address, has a number of big problems that absolutely require nations, cultures to work together. And this takes place at a time of geopolitical conflict. And we need to think very carefully about how to do global problem solving within this new context. It's by no means impossible, and in some funny way, we may find greater possibilities for global problem solving now, because I think everyone in the world recognizes the need and the urgency to solve common problems collectively.
Dennis? Sorry, Colm. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Hi, Annette, and hello, everybody. So, Colm Kelly from PwC. So, I've had the honour of participating in this forum actually since 2017, as Herr Rodler mentioned earlier. And it's, I suppose, a reflection of our very sincerely held view that we and other businesses have to be willing to participate constructively and collaboratively in a multi-stakeholder forum in order to address the kinds of global challenge which we clearly face. And I look forward to getting into the detail of some of that actually in the conversation. On that. Yeah.
I'd like to take the opportunity as well for you, Gabriela, to say a couple of words where we stand, first mostly on the pandemic issue, right?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Dennis, and the Global Solutions Summit for calling on us. I'm sorry I cannot be with you today, but I could not miss it because I have been also part of this discussion since the very inception as OECD Sherpa at the time, but now I'm the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences at UNESCO. And as the title says, I'm concerned about societal transformation and how much the COVID unequal asymmetric impact is dividing already unequal societies and also bringing apart developing and advanced economies. We're worried about the digital trends. Of course, we are supportive and amazed of how much the technologies can make impact, but we're also looking at the ethical issues of artificial intelligence, and we're looking also at many other trends that are impacting in our societies, like climate. Everything has gotten more complicated with the war. So I'm looking forward to these discussions because the already high impact on the economy is going to be worse.
Thank you very much to each of you. And before we start the discussion, I'd also like to encourage you here in the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, just raise your hands. We have microphones which then can be delivered to you. And also for the online audience, you can put questions into the chat function, which then will reach us as well here on the panel. So perhaps we jump right into the topic to take stock of the situation where we are. I would like actually to start off with you, Gabriela, where we stand in terms of what has changed with the pandemic, what are the challenges to also policy setting and policy making across the world.
Well, I feel that this very clear, and UNESCO being a global institution, that the pandemic was lived differently, not only among countries that have the fiscal space to protect their societies and their economies and to keep going, countries that did not, countries that were vaccinated immediately, countries that were not. And I have to say that something that was worrisome was the lack of solidarity because countries decided to go national in many ways. Yes, there were important efforts, above all in the G20 and the WHO, but I feel that this asymmetric impact is going to take us forward for quite some time in terms of looking for solutions, particularly for low-income countries. But there's also asymmetric impacts. Women, we know that this crisis had a women face because the sectors affected where women were overrepresented, but also because they had less leverage, financial leverage to weigh the pandemic. Youth, I think this is something that we really need to put in front of us because I have been pushing for long to have a people-centered analysis and decision-making. And now we have 1 out of 7 youth aged from 19 to 24 risking having very strong mental health issues. And this is a call that we really need to hear high and clear. And then just let me share with you, at a moment where we have this very steep fall in GDP globally that pushed 160 people to poverty, first time in decades, we also have this very step increase in wealth capitalization of the richest people of the world. So 5 trillion. So if we thought that inequalities were high, today they are just staggering. And the fact is that we need to understand better that these are not silos. It's not like the inequalities or climate or
Yeah.
gender or digital. They are compounded and we need to understand them together. And as Dennis has proposed so many times, change the narrative, understand better how these things work, and produce better policy decision making.
Perhaps, yeah, we bring that directly to Dennis, because I think you have a very firm view on what needs to be done, especially after the pandemic, but also already before, because like there are big trends which are changing our societies and our economies, right?
Yes, and I'd like to bring to the fore one important trend connected with one important challenge. The new trend is that there will be some globalization in reverse. There'll be more emphasis on resilience, and that also means political, not only economic resilience. And that will require some retrenchment. And so from a purely efficiency perspective, this will be a move back. But in a world that is uncertain, to focus more on resilience is very useful. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves, and should have asked ourselves ages ago, is globalization an unalloyed benefit for the world? And this question will now be asked within this new context. And as I've indicated, globalization has been connected with communities that failed, say, in the Rust Belt in the States, small town England, and many other places. It has been met with associated with a sense of disempowerment and substantial environmental degradation. The time has come, I believe, for us to measure not only the economic, but also the social and environmental impacts. And once these impacts are measured, there are huge potential gains, because when we deal with global problems globally, keeping in mind the social, environmental, and economic impacts of what we do, it will become much clearer to people that there are gains to be had for everyone involved, so that a collective action is reconcilable with nationalism. And bringing that to the fore was impossible when we just looked at the globalization from an economic perspective. Having the social and environmental perspectives measured, reported on, with governance structures, supporting it across business and policy. So it will help also change social norms. That could create a new wave for our dealing responsibly with collective challenges.
Perhaps I would like to ask Professor Bambang next, because you're coming from an emerging market as well. And we were just hearing that Corona has put a lot of pressure, especially on emerging markets, and you're also the co-lead of the G20 or T20 solution. Where do we stand in your view, and what are the most pressing topics we should discuss on a global scale now?
Yeah. First of all, because this is the first session of this Global Solution Summit, let me thank Global Solution Initiative for involving the T20 Indonesia in this very important forum. As I mentioned before, the topic of Indonesia's G20 presidency is recover together, recover stronger. And of course, the basic question that will apply would be what kind of recovery that we are looking for. Maybe basic answer would be how to bring the economy back to performance prior to the pandemic. Of course, it might be impossible, it might be not too much difficult, even some countries already back to their, let's say, economic growth prior to the pandemic. But as you rightly mentioned, we are facing now totally different global problem. First of all, the pandemic, in my opinion, and I think many share with us, that the pandemic is the worst economic crisis ever, I believe, in history. I mean, we can compare this to the 2008 global financial crisis, 1998 Asian financial crisis, or even 1929 Great Depression. I believe this is the worst economic crisis, and it's not because the so-called global financial architecture. It's because of something that is not man-made. And I believe now human beings realize that the pandemic and also climate change could be the next threat that we have to anticipate. So to answer your question, our pressing agenda will be how to mainstream the climate change or energy transition into our economic policy. Of course, climate change has been there. Prior to pandemic, we already have more than 20 COPs held in different countries. But still, the commitment and the seriousness towards the climate change is not there yet. But because of the pandemic, and people realize that the biggest threat to human being is not something that coming from the man-made situation, then people start to realize that we need to be more serious. We need to accelerate energy transition in order to fulfill the ideas of mitigating the climate change. Another issue would be, of course, digital disruption. We know that prior to pandemic, Industrial Revolution 4.0, digitalization has been the common words. But because of the pandemic, we realized that digital could help, but at the same time, it might create the threat to inequality because of the digital divide. So after this pandemic, then we need to mainstream the digitalization into our economic development strategy. And at the same time, we also witnessed during the pandemic, digital could provide a lot of positive impacts to human beings, education, health, as well as creating equality. As Secretary General of OECD mentioned, digitalization could really help small and medium enterprise to survive during the pandemic and forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have the difficult task here somewhat to talk about the pandemic, but also about the war and what it means for businesses, for policy setting, but also for big changes on the geopolitical sphere. And that is, of course, Daniela's topic. So I'd like to ask you what your assessment of the current situation is, and also what it actually then means for global cooperation, because that's so crucial to tackle all these problems we have been already alluding to.
Thank you, Annette. I think the striking element in the situation is that all the challenges that the three previous speakers have outlined in themselves deserve all attention. But right now, from a European perspective, the focus is very much on the war, which from Berlin is only 2 flight hours away, basically. So this is in our very closest neighborhood. And this war is in many ways extremely appalling, but also very challenging if we look at the long-term issues. Appalling because what we see is a war and aggression on a country that had gone a long way in its own democratic transition, and was actually orienting itself towards Europe very clearly and towards a cooperative relationship. Now, some governments have already started investigations into war crimes committed by Russia, and others speak of genocide. So this is very serious. If you look at the consequences for global governance, Russia is a member of the United Nations Security Council. This is a situation which politically is extremely difficult to handle. The positive news is that in the General Assemblies, the support for the resolution which condemned Russia early on in the war was very strong. So 141 countries actually sided with those who want peace in Ukraine. So here's an important positive message, but the problem, of course, remains how to deal with Russia in international settings. All negotiation attempts so far have gone nowhere. Now, the other question, of course, on a very broad scale is, what is the situation of our security order these days? In Europe, it is evident that the old principles don't hold anymore. But the question goes beyond, because Russia has threatened others, including the United States, with nuclear attacks. And so here we are in a situation where the fundamental pillars of our order after the Second World War are actually in question. Now, the economic and social consequences of this war will be huge, and previous speakers have mentioned the devastating effects of the COVID pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, in particular for low-income countries. If you look at the role that Ukraine and Russia together play as exporters of agricultural products, for instance, wheat, it's 25% of global wheat production that those countries together produce, 75% of sunflower oil, and much of that is actually exported to countries that are in dire need for those deliveries. And so the repercussions of this war are already very strong, but we will see, further effects, in particular if this year's agricultural production doesn't advance. So I think we will be concerned with the situation, but on a positive note, and linking to what Dennis Snow said, we also see in this case a huge realization that we need cooperation. The EU got its act together in a very quick and impressive way. Transatlantic cooperation is back. The whole question of reconstruction and rebuilding is already on the table, although we are still in a hot war. And so I think there is a profound realization among political leaders, civil society, but also corporates, that with this multiple crisis, COVID being the first, then the repercussions in the economic area, which creates huge inequalities, and now an additional war, which may have implications well beyond the region, really requires our best efforts. And this is not only governments, this has to be civil society, and it already is, if you look at the huge efforts in Ukraine every day. So I think we are indeed at a moment where it is absolutely necessary to profoundly rethink how all actors that we have together mentioned can work together on a more stable future.
One actor we haven't referred to yet, thank you very much, Daniela, is the business side of things, corporates. And I mean, you, in your capacity, do speak a lot to corporations. How are they assessing the situation, and are they changing the way they do business, or are they rethinking the way they do business?
I would say a qualified yes, and so maybe let me reflect on perhaps three themes which I think have been and continue to be the subject of impact from a business perspective. And a number of them actually have been touched on by the other speakers. I think the first is flexibility, and that's particularly in response to the COVID crisis. It was quite remarkable the degree to which businesses actually, with great pace and scale, flexed business models and working practices in a way that I firmly believe would never have been anticipated. That should give us some cause for optimism, if you like, because it highlights the capacity to respond at pace and scale to deal collaboratively in response to a global problem. Not perfect, but an indication of the capacity for change. I would say the second was touched on by Dennis, actually, which is that when you have an undue emphasis on efficiency, and in particular on financial efficiency, you create fragility. And it is very obvious that in today's complex, dynamic, uncertain world, you have to have resilience, which means that I think that balance between financial efficiency on the one hand, which has been the bedrock, the historic bedrock of the way in which our economic and business models have been operating, that clearly needs to evolve in order for resilience to play a much greater part.
But what do you mean by resilience? I mean, the resilience is something which you can't just get overnight. So what does it mean?
Yeah, so and I'm going to go there because actually that brings me very nicely to the third theme, which is that the ability to respond to these kinds of crises, these kinds of globally complex issues, by definition has to reflect a high degree of interdependence, and that is very different. In other words, we have to have collaboration between governments and businesses and civil society in order to be able to respond to these kinds of challenges. And I think that does bring, that resilience challenge immediately brings you to the recoupling theme. Because the underlying premise of the way in which we organise our economies and our businesses has to be more oriented towards ensuring that we deliver outcomes from market economies, but we deliver outcomes which are consistent with the prosperity of the societies and communities within which businesses operate, and which are consistent with doing so sustainably for nature and for our planet. That systemic transformation, which Dennis and others have talked about, is profoundly significant and really, by the day, gets more urgent.
Perhaps not everybody is used to the term recoupling. Perhaps, Dennis, you could briefly enlighten us what you mean by that.
The idea is very simple. It is possible for economic prosperity to become decoupled from social and environmental prosperity. When income worldwide in aggregate rises, but many people feel left behind, communities suffer, people feel disempowered, the natural world is destabilized, that is a good example of decoupling. And when that happens, we need to focus on the needs of people, starting with the needs. I'm so sorry. We should focus on the needs of people, starting with the needs of the neediest, now and in the future. That means environmental sustainability. And recouple economic prosperity with social and environmental prosperity. And what does that mean? It means that our economic system is here to serve society, not the other way around. Yeah. And in doing so, we start thinking about the economy in new ways. Its social implications, environmental implications that we have often left to one side.
One topic, or the topic of that session, is listening to the world. So given that we are probably in a more diverse world than 3 years ago, and now even a more uncertain world, how important is it, and another question to you, Dennis, that we really listen to all stakeholders across the globe to find common solutions?
I'd like to say two things about this. One is that it is a particularly important time for Indonesia to have the G20 presidency. Because with Indonesia starts a new perspective on global problem solving, the Asian perspective. Indonesia's presidency will be followed by India's presidency. This will be a new way of thinking about global problems, must be taken really seriously, and it is our job to see things from that perspective, much as Indonesia has seen it from our perspective in the past.
Yeah.
That's, am I permitted sort of one more, which is, we need to think in terms of the ultimate outcome that we want. And if the ultimate outcome is an inclusive, sustainable, prosperous world, then we need to think, what do we need to do now to get there? And in a world of geopolitical conflict, where we feel we've been wronged and now we need to set this right, we often respond in ways that lose sight of this. If I could just say one thing now, not as president of Global Solutions, but simply in my personal capacity as Dennis Snower. If at the end of this conflict, we find that all countries of the world agree that we need a rules-based multilateral order based on human rights, and that we need in some way to solve global problems in a common way, then it is the responsibility of the entire world community to deal with the fallout of this conflict. And when this conflict has ended, this will be bad news not only for the Ukrainian economy, but also for the Russian economy. And the process of rebuilding both is as important now as it would have been to rebuild Germany in the interwar period. And therefore, I personally would be very much in favor already now to start thinking under the premise that we have again a rules-based, democratic, multilateral order and a willingness to solve global problems in a common way, that there be the equivalent of a Marshall Plan for both the Ukraine and Russia.
That's that's a bold statement. But Daniela, what do you think? Is there, from the Russian side, after the war, would there be a willingness to sign up to multilateralism?
Well, we know nothing today about what happens within Russia in the next few years, and that will be very decisive to answer your question. First of all, on multilateralism, I think Russia has strong interests to actually be reintegrated into the world. If you look at the economic costs, which Dennis Noah mentioned, they are huge for Russia, and they may even rise if the path is accelerated, meaning less importations of oil and gas to the political West. So the costs on Russia will be huge. The costs of the war, the retreat of many companies from Russia, and all the sort of economic sanctions around. The question for me is, frankly, not only Russia, but also how China positions itself, and the vision of having a renaissance of rule-based order and human rights-based principles in that order. That would be a great future. We also have to take into consideration a second scenario, which is a world more or less split, where you have, which we currently see, a re-strengthening of the political West on its own principles, and other countries that are looking very closely at how Russia and China position themselves in this conflict. So that's the negative scenario, clearly. If the world falls further apart and we see a decoupling of those spheres, not only politically in governance, but also more economic decoupling.
Yeah.
However, the reconstruction point is extremely important. It goes along with the need for political reconciliation. And before that can happen, we need to create a lot of transparency on what is actually happening in Ukraine today. So the whole process, post-war Europe was not only the master plan, it was, the Marshall Plan, it was an enormously important element, but there was a fundamental approach to political reconciliation, to litigation of crimes in Germany and other countries committed by the Nazi regime and the collaborators. And so the question really is, how can we manage all of this? Because I think it has to happen, not only for the sake of Ukraine, but also for Russia. And today what we see is a war that the Russian people have little knowledge of, because the audience, the public in Russia is very much controlled, and more so by the day. So when this war ends, the question of what is happening in Russia, not only who leads Russia, but also how does the population look at what happens, and how does the population formulate their wishes for the future. I think those are crucial elements we today know little about.
Yeah, I'd like to bring the debate, though, also back to the global issues and which are the most important to tackle. And that brings me directly to you, Mr. Bambang, because you have a priority for like the biggest themes which we need to tackle. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah. I remember my experience when I was still involved with the G20 finance track. At that time, the debate is only about two keywords, the global financial architecture and monetary policy coordination. I think those two are very critical to ensure there will be no more global financial crisis like 2008. But I believe now with the, changing situation, especially with the climate change, with the war issue, as well as the pandemic issue, then I believe the discussion should be beyond GDP, beyond traditional economic growth, and has to try to include the issue of climate change, energy transition, the digital disruption, as well as the global health management into the picture. So, of course, the economic recovery will be more complicated, but I believe we have to focus on the three characteristics. I believe the inclusivity, sustainability, and resiliency. I think those three will be the characters of the economic recovery for the future.
Okay, well, thank you. Gabriele, I would like to bring you in as well. So, what's your assessment? How's the appetite around the world to really focus on social policy making right after 2 years of a pandemic? Because obviously the budgets of many countries are pretty much strained.
Well, I think that your question is exactly framing the challenge we face. At a moment where we really need to focus on providing solutions to people, yes, but budgets are tight, but then you have a war, and therefore investments are going to that war. And then we cannot forget the impact that our societies just face. And I cannot agree more with Bang Bang and with Dennis. The societal issues need to come close to the fore. We need to redouble the efforts, even in this context that is so difficult. But if not, we are just going to wake up with more divisions in our societies, more fractures, more problems with our democratic processes because of radicalization of the political debate. And therefore, we need to really come with solutions for people. And how do we do that? I think it has been said around the table. We need to put equality and sustainability, and I would say also resilience, in the same level of importance in the economic models as we do with efficiency. And we need to measure progress differently. But let me tell you, now that Dennis has called for this Marshall Plan, I will say that we need a new deal. We need a new social contract. And we need to understand that investment in our societies, in our youth, in our people, in our women, are not social afterthought issues. They are part of the core. Because as inequality was growing even before the financial crisis and even before the pandemic, so now it's really a disaster, the question was that productivity was not growing and the economies were not growing as fast because we were decoupling with the bottom of the income distribution, that were not investing in their skills. So we need to rephrase these issues and we need to rechannel them to improve the outcomes for people. I think that this is the call. Maybe we don't have the perfect economic models, but if there is leadership and if there is vision, I think that we will just need to rebuild the social contract, invest more on our societies. The social protection systems need to be rethought. And we cannot lose sight, I know that is difficult because there are so many things that tear us apart, but there is this urgency, and the social urgency should not be put aside. It's really important.
Perhaps I can ask you about thank you, Gabriele, I'm sorry, because time is running so quickly and we still have like a last chapter to tackle. I'd like to ask you a question. like a practical one, because we have seen a lot of movement on climate change policies in Europe, and Europe wants to, like, I think, model itself like perhaps as the good kid in the international club, and everybody can follow. So we are the first mover. What do you think? Is that true? And can we do that on a standalone basis? And the rest of the world is watching us and thinks like, well, we have very tight rules, but we do more business elsewhere.
Yeah, look, I mean, the short answer is no, because of course climate is a truly global problem, which means that we truly need global collaboration and an appropriate global response to be able to deal with that. But actually that also means that we have to listen to the world, right? It means that the framework within which we make progress against climate has to reflect the reality of where different countries are actually starting from. And they are profoundly different. And I think I would strongly agree with Dennis. Having a perspective coming from Indonesia and then India into these conversations is truly, truly essential for that reason. But it also means then that the journey that countries take in order to respond must reflect their ability to progress against that journey, and the collaboration is required in order to equip all countries to do what they need to do to respond.
So in other words, we should be happy with different standards across the globe. For example, the COP26 outcome, some people were overwhelmed and others were disappointed. So it's up to the position where you are, right?
Well, of course. I mean, look, so let me be very blunt. It's not only unrealistic, it's unjust to expect a country to commit to decarbonise at a pace which is greater than its ability to provide alternatives to its citizens, which means that a standardised overall ambition, which frankly reflects a largely Western perspective on these conversations, is actually destructive because it creates mistrust and it hampers the ability of countries to actually move. So I don't think anybody is in the position of arguing that we don't need progress against climate. But we now live in a multipolar world. Right? And if anything, the events of the last several months have highlighted that reality. I think it's been there for a long time, but I think, again, for us in the West, it highlights that reality, which means that a multilateral approach to these issues must also reflect that multipolar nature, that reality which we now have in play.
Yeah. So we only have like 3.5 minutes left, but I'd like to ask you, Dennis, about your assessment of the current situation, because of course there are loads of challenges and there's loads of bad news every morning. We are reading through the press, but is there also some positive take on where we stand and what it means for global policy making, i.e. perhaps more cooperation around the globe?
I think one thing that everybody is aware of now is of the dangers of war, and also of the dangers of nuclear war, biological and chemical, and the need to solve these problems collectively. That will carry over, hopefully, to other global problem-solving issues, but if one could just stick to this, we need to maintain the anti-war international norm. That means that the Treaty on Nuclear Non-Proliferation needs to be widened and strengthened. It means that the conventions against biological and chemical weapons need to be broadened and made more verifiable. It means that the Geneva Convention on war needs to be extended to cyber warfare. There's a lot on the table there, and if we simply pursue those goals, the analog with climate change, pandemics, the three threats that you've talked about in the health, the digital energy transition will become apparent, and I think that energy should be used.
Yeah. Professor Bambang, perhaps shortly, because you said that the corona pandemic was the biggest crisis. So do you think that it also means going forward that we have more focus on health issues, health systems as well, as a lesson learned from that?
Yes, certainly. In fact, in our, Indonesia presidency, one of the kind of target of the outcome is to create the new architecture of the global health fund management. I believe we don't have that kind of fund management before. It might be scattered in some MDBs, multilateral development banks. But now, I think we need to have it as a pool rather than scattered all over the places.
Perhaps a question to you, Colm, whether we are going to see more cooperation. I mean, because I think that could really be one outcome of that current crisis, that the West is more united. We've never seen such a united West. President Biden coming to a meeting, to EU leader meeting, I don't know when that was the last time. So do you think that will help?
Well, absolutely, to a point. Right? So, for example, I think that united response in the West will probably help reinforce the political impetus behind energy transition, for example. And I think it'll probably help do that across the globe. But by definition, these multipolar global problems have to be addressed in a manner which reflects a degree of inclusiveness in the conversation across the board. And that cannot be limited to just a conversation either in or led by the West. And that's the challenge. And I think Dennis has said this repeatedly, it's finding the balance between what needs to be done, taking the initiative in a way which allows, for example, in this case, maybe Europe to take a leadership position, but then ensuring that the engagement process goes beyond that. And I'd like to pick up on a point that Gabriela made, because I think it's really important. This embedding of the social context within which these economic and indeed political discussions take place is paramount. And I'll give you a very practical example to bring that to life. We have, as rightly, a substantive conversation underway about carbon taxes being used as a mechanism to price carbon out of the market. And technically, that is, of course, an appropriate response. But if carbon taxes don't recognise the reality of their impact, particularly on the less well-off in the societies on which they are to be imposed, then they will be rejected. And so not only will we create more social division, actually we impede the ability to address the underlying climate problem as well. Yeah. Designing for those social issues in these economic problems is essential for that purpose.
So we're running out of time, but I just make the executive decision to take another question from the floor. Just the sir here in the back. Can you bring him a mic? Perhaps you. Someone bringing him a microphone? Okay.
Thank you very much. It's good to be together. I'm Jeff Sachs. I want to observe that there are two very different themes and discussions going on in the world, and we're conflating them a bit. One is the global challenges, and we're here because we believe in that. That is very different from the discussion about the war, or even about the United West, as it were. Because if you listen to what President Biden said on Sunday, he's talking about a long conflict. And if you look at what the United States government says, they're talking about a conflict with China, with Russia, to divide the world, not to unite the world. We should be pretty clear that there are not, as Dennis hopes, a common view on these issues. I'm coming from a quite militarized country that has a very different view of these issues, and I just wanted to point that out. We're in trouble because we do not have a shared view in this world of the need for peace, cooperation, and global problem solving. Okay, we have a divided world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are really running out of time, but a last possibility to answer that statement, perhaps for you.
I think in all the sessions that follow, we should address these issues as they are profound.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation, albeit the time was very brief, and I hope you also enjoyed it. We're heading into a very short break now, and then we'll be back by 25, I think, with the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.